I announced my pregnancy at my husband's party. Minutes later, my SEL handed me food laced with poison. On my wedding day, Jessica showed up in a black mourning dress, veil and all, silently telling every guest she was grieving the death of her brother. She wasn't crying over Harry, though. She was mourning the life she thought I had stolen from her. If someone looked at my life from the outside, they'd think I had it all: a loving husband, an adorable son, and a stable, happy home. Harry and I had been married for 7 years, a marriage built on love, respect, and understanding. We had solid careers, never had to rely on anyone, and above all, we were genuinely happy. But like any perfect picture, there was a crack that only I could see. Jessica. When I first met Jessica, Harry's older sister, I actually liked her. She was confident, independent, and had this magnetic energy that drew people in. She seemed like the kind of person you'd want as a friend. But over time, I started to notice things. Subtle at first, but impossible to ignore. Jessica wasn't just a protective older sister. She was possessive, controlling, and no one in the family ever dared to call her out on it. It became clear that Jessica didn't just care about Harry's happiness. She wanted to decide who was allowed to make him happy. And it certainly wasn't me. I still remember the first time she made me uncomfortable. It was during a family dinner, the kind where everyone was laughing, sharing stories, until Jessica casually brought up one of Harry's exes. "You know," she said, smiling just a little too much, "they were such a great couple, right, Harry?" The room fell silent. My stomach twisted. Harry barely looked up from his plate. "That was a long time ago, Jess." His tone was light, but I could see the tension in his jaw. Jessica just shrugged and took a sip of her wine, like she hadn't just deliberately thrown a grenade onto the table. And that was just the beginning. She started bringing up Harry's exes more often, mentioning them in casual conversation, even inviting them to family gatherings under the guise of, "Oh, I just ran into her. What a coincidence." She was always the first to view our photos on social media, but never liked or commented. And then there was the time Harry overheard her talking to their mom. "Are you sure he really wants to marry her?" Jessica had said, voice low but sharp. "I think he could do so much better." Their mom, Susan, had just sighed and said nothing. When Harry told me about it later, I felt my stomach drop. My hands went cold. That was when I knew. This wasn't just an overprotective sister. Jessica didn't want me in his life, and I had no idea how far she'd go to make that happen. Jessica didn't like me, that much was clear. But for someone who supposedly couldn't stand me, she sure loved inserting herself into every aspect of my wedding. At first, I tried to convince myself she was just being an overbearing sister-in-law, that maybe she didn't realize how much her comments stung. But deep down, I knew better. Jessica's words weren't careless. They were calculated. One afternoon, I was sitting with my mother-in-law, Susan, flipping through a wedding catalog, discussing floral arrangements. I had my heart set on white roses, simple, elegant. But before Susan could even respond, Jessica leaned over from across the table, sipping her coffee like she owned the room. "Ugh, white roses? They look so cheap. Why not go for something classier? Like, oh, I don't know, the orchids Lily had at her wedding?" Lily. One of Harry's exes. I stared at her, my grip tightening on the catalog. It wasn't just a suggestion. It was a reminder. A reminder that she still thought someone else should have been standing at the altar with Harry. Susan shifted uncomfortably, offering me a sympathetic glance, but she didn't say anything. She never did when it came to Jessica. And that was the moment I stopped trying to pretend Jessica was just difficult. No, this wasn't unintentional. She had a goal. And it was to make me feel like an outsider in my own marriage. The tension built up for weeks. Every time I made a decision for my wedding, Jessica had something to say. The color scheme was boring. The venue was too small. My dress was too plain. I bit my tongue, over and over. But one evening, as we sat around the family dining table discussing the reception decor, she pushed too far. "Gold accents? Wow, that's bold. But hey, if that's the look you're going for, I mean, it's not what I'd pick," but I snapped. "Jessica, if you hate my wedding so much, maybe you shouldn't come." Silence. Thick, suffocating silence. Susan's fork clattered against her plate. Robert, Harry's dad, cleared his throat, looking away. And Jessica? She just stared at me, eyes wide, like she couldn't believe someone had actually dared to stand up to her. Then, without a word, she stood, grabbed her purse, and walked out the door. I exhaled, hands shaking. Harry reached for my hand under the table, giving it a reassuring squeeze, but no one said a word. Not Susan, not Robert, because deep down, they all knew I was right. For days, Jessica disappeared. No texts, no calls, and honestly, I thought maybe that was it, that she'd finally gotten the message. Then, one evening, Harry's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, sighed, and showed it to me. "Your wife humiliated me in front of the entire family. You need to control her." I expected Harry to argue, to defend me, to tell her she was being ridiculous, but he didn't. He just locked his phone and placed it face down on the table. He didn't even bother responding. A week later, I got a text from Jessica myself. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable. I'd really love to be at your wedding. Hope you can forgive me." If I hadn't known better, I might have believed her. But I did know better. That apology wasn't real. It was a chess move, a calculated way to keep herself in the picture. I never responded. For a while, everything seemed fine. The wedding day arrived, and it was perfect. The venue was gorgeous, the ceremony went smoothly, and everyone was having a great time. Until Jessica arrived. She walked in late, like she wanted to make an entrance. And my God, did she ever! She was dressed in a floor-length, jet black gown, a mourning dress. A black lace veil covered her face like she was attending a funeral. And then, she started circulating. I watched, frozen in horror, as she moved from guest to guest, speaking in hushed tones. Their expressions shifted from confusion to discomfort, and soon enough, I started hearing whispers. Jessica said she's grieving. What exactly is she grieving? She told me she lost her brother today. What does that even mean? My stomach dropped. She wasn't just ruining my wedding. She was staging a performance. A silent protest, a mockery of my marriage. I looked at Harry. His jaw was clenched, hands fisted at his sides. His mother, Susan, looked mortified. His father, Robert, finally had enough. I watched as Robert strode up to Jessica and whispered something in her ear. I didn't hear what he said, but whatever it was, it worked. Because for the first time, Jessica looked stunned, and then Robert motioned to the venue staff. A minute later, Jessica was being escorted out. She didn't fight, didn't argue, just walked out, silent and slow, like a widow leaving a funeral. And for the first time, someone in Harry's family had actually stood up to her. But as I watched her go, something inside me knew. Jessica wasn't done, not by a long shot. After the wedding, Jessica disappeared. No calls, no messages, not even a single passive-aggressive comment on social media. At first, I was relieved. For the first time in years, Harry and I had peace. We built our life together, without her shadow looming over us. A year passed, and in that time, we welcomed our son, Ethan. Those first few months were exhausting, but beautiful. Harry and I had settled into a rhythm. Midnight feedings, sleepy mornings, little moments of joy. We were happy. And then, just when I started to believe Jessica was finally out of our lives, she came back. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon. There was a knock at the door, and when I opened it, there she was. But this wasn't the Jessica I remembered. She looked different, hollowed out, exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed like she'd been crying. "I'm sorry," she said, voice trembling. "I was wrong." I didn't know what to say. Jessica, apologizing? It felt surreal. Then she told us. 2 years ago, she had been pregnant and lost the baby. She said the grief consumed her, turned her into someone she didn't recognize. That was why she acted the way she did, why she lashed out. "I didn't know how to handle the pain," she whispered, tears welling up. "I let it turn me into a terrible person." She asked for a second chance. She wanted to meet Ethan. I hesitated. Something inside me screamed no, but when I looked at Harry, I saw the conflict in his eyes. Despite everything, this was still his sister, and a part of me, whether out of pity or exhaustion, wanted to believe her. So I said yes. At first, it seemed like Jessica had changed. She was gentle with Ethan, bringing him little gifts, playing with him, acting like the perfect aunt. But something still felt off. Every time she held him, she would whisper something into his ear, too quiet for anyone else to hear. One day, after she left, I asked Ethan what she had said. "She told me you don't love her," he said simply, stuffing a cracker into his mouth. I felt my stomach twist. It got worse. Jessica started slipping comments into conversation. Small, calculated remarks meant to poke at old wounds. "It's funny, isn't it?" she mused one evening. "How much Harry loved Lily. I mean, we all thought they'd get married one day." I set my fork down, barely containing my irritation. It was happening again. The manipulation, the mind games. But the worst moment came when I overheard her talking to Ethan. "When you grow up, you'll still love your Aunt Jessica, right? You won't be mean to me like your mom was." A chill ran down my spine. While Jessica played the role of the loving aunt, her own marriage was crumbling. She and Daniel had been married less than a year, but the cracks were obvious. The biggest problem? They couldn't have children. Jessica was obsessed with the idea of becoming a mother, and when it didn't happen, she turned on Daniel. She blamed him, told everyone he was the problem. She humiliated him in front of family and friends, making snide remarks about his inadequacy. And Daniel? He never fought back. He just took it, withdrawing further into himself. Jessica, of course, never admitted any fault. Instead, she started looking for an escape. And that's when she asked if she could stay with us for a while. At first, it was supposed to be temporary. "Just until I figure things out," she had said. But within days of moving in, Jessica's presence started to feel invasive. She watched me. I'd wake up in the morning and find her already sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, eyes tracking my every move. It was unsettling. She asked strange, probing questions, always laced with something accusatory. One morning, as I was lacing up my sneakers to go to the gym, she casually remarked, "You go to the gym a lot." I laughed. "Yeah, you know, gotta stay in shape." She didn't smile. She just stared at me for a moment before saying, "Or maybe you're meeting someone there." I froze. It wasn't a joke. Her voice was too steady, her expression too blank. She was implying something. I forced a chuckle. "Jessica, that's ridiculous." She just shrugged, sipping her coffee. That night, lying in bed next to Harry, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jessica wasn't just here to stay. She was here to dig, to find something, anything that she could twist. And I had no idea what she would do next. Jessica was getting bolder. At first, it was whispers, little comments here and there, just enough to plant a seed of doubt. But now, she wasn't just hinting. She was coming straight for me, for my marriage, and for my family. It started one evening over dinner. We were sitting around the table, me, Harry, his parents, and of course, Jessica. The conversation had been light, mostly small talk about a mutual friend going through a messy divorce. And then, right as there was a pause, Jessica struck. "Harry, did you and Emily sign a prenup?" The room went silent. Harry, who had been reaching for his glass, froze mid-motion. Slowly, he put it down and looked at her. "No," he said simply. "We trust each other." Jessica let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "Wow, that's risky. You know how common cheating is these days, right? You should really be careful." The air shifted. I felt my stomach tighten as everyone exchanged uneasy glances. I clenched my fork. "Jessica, what exactly are you trying to say?" She smiled, feigning innocence. Nothing. Just making conversation." But we all knew better. If that was the first knife, the second came moments later, sharp, brutal, and aimed straight at my heart. Jessica tilted her head, her voice light, almost playful. "By the way, have you ever noticed how Ethan doesn't really look like Harry?" The words landed like a grenade. The room fell into absolute stillness. Susan's breath hitched. Robert stiffened. And Harry. Harry slowly turned to face her, his expression unreadable. I felt my pulse in my throat. Harry's voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously low. What did you just say? Jessica shrugged, her nails tapping against her wine glass. I mean, I'm just saying, genetics are weird, right? It's not impossible that… Harry shot up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. Are you actually suggesting my son isn't mine? Jessica didn't flinch. I'm just saying, maybe it wouldn't hurt to check. Susan gasped. Robert's face darkened. My entire body went cold. Jessica had always been cruel, but this was something else. Harry's hands curled into fists at his sides. His voice shook, not with sadness, but with pure, unfiltered rage. You're disgusting. Jessica blinked, as if genuinely surprised. Harry, don't overreact. Overreact? His voice was a razor's edge. You're sitting here, at my dinner table, calling my wife a cheater and implying my son isn't mine. And you expect me to stay calm? Jessica rolled her eyes. God, you're so sensitive. Shut up, Harry snapped, his voice slicing through the air. Just shut the hell up. His breathing was uneven, his face flushed with fury. And then, his next words cut through Jessica like a blade. You don't deserve to be a mother. The color drained from Jessica's face. The baby you lost. Maybe it was better that way. No child deserves to grow up with a mother like you. The silence that followed was suffocating. Jessica's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. And then, for the first time in her life, Jessica looked small. That night was the breaking point. After that, everything collapsed. Susan and Robert came over the next day, their faces heavy with exhaustion. Susan sighed, rubbing her temples. We let this go on for too long. Robert nodded. She's done. She's not welcome here anymore. Jessica had finally done the one thing none of us thought possible. She had turned everyone against her. But something inside me knew this wasn't over. Jessica never lost. Not completely. And the way she had looked at me before she walked out that night, it wasn't regret. It was a promise. 2 months had passed since we cut Jessica out of our lives completely. No calls, no messages, not even a desperate attempt to claw her way back in. For the first time in years, our world felt peaceful. And then, something unexpected happened. I found out I was pregnant. It wasn't planned, but when I saw the 2 pink lines, my heart swelled with joy. Harry was over the moon, and we decided there was no better time to share the news than at his birthday party, surrounded by family. Susan and Robert planned a beautiful outdoor gathering at their home, inviting all our closest friends and relatives. The air was filled with laughter, the scent of grilled food, and the warm glow of twinkling lights. Everything was perfect, until she arrived. Jessica. I felt it before I even saw her, that familiar cold shiver crawling down my spine. The party had been in full swing when I turned and spotted her, standing just beyond the patio, as if she had simply appeared out of nowhere. She wasn't invited. No one had spoken to her in months. And yet, there she was. Harry tensed beside me, his jaw locking. But before he could say anything, Jessica rushed forward and threw her arms around him. I've missed you so much, Harry, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry, I was wrong. Then she turned to me. Emily, she said softly, I've been in therapy. I've been working on myself. I see now how much I hurt you both. I just want to make things right. I didn't believe a word of it. But with everyone watching, expecting me to show grace, I forced a tight smile and nodded. As the evening went on, the moment we had been waiting for arrived. Harry took my hand, his smile wide as he clinked his glass. Emily and I have some exciting news to share, he announced. We're expecting another baby. The crowd erupted in cheers. Susan hugged me. Robert clapped Harry on the back, and our friends swarmed us with congratulations. Everyone was smiling. Everyone except Jessica. For a split second, her entire face went rigid. It was only a flicker, barely noticeable. But I saw it. The way her fingers curled into fists, the way her eyes darkened, the way her breath hitched ever so slightly. And then, just as quickly as it came, the mask slipped back into place. She clapped, beaming, her voice bright and cheerful. That's wonderful. I'm so happy for you both. But I knew what I had seen. Had I imagined it? Later, as I sat down at one of the patio tables, Jessica approached, carrying a plate of food. Here, she said, placing it in front of me. I picked this out just for you. I know how important it is for pregnant women to eat right. I stared at the plate. My stomach twisted. Shrimp, a pile of them, perfectly arranged, glistening under the dim party lights. I was deathly allergic, Jessica knew that. My pulse quickened. Did she expect me to eat it? Was she testing me? Watching to see if I'd realize? I swallowed hard, my mind racing. If I refused, it would cause a scene. But if I ate even a bite? Before I could react, Daniel, Jessica's husband, walked past, glancing down at my untouched plate. Not hungry? I'll take it, he said casually, reaching for a fork. Daniel, wait! I started, but it was too late. He took a bite, then another. 5 minutes later, Daniel's face went pale. He swayed slightly, then gagged. And suddenly, he was vomiting, his body convulsing as he collapsed to the ground. Screams filled the air. Someone shouted for an ambulance. Guests backed away in shock as Susan knelt beside Daniel, trying to steady him. Jessica shrieked, dropping to her knees next to him. Oh my God, what's happening? Someone help him! I couldn't move. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. That plate was meant for me. Paramedics arrived, rushing Daniel to the hospital. Hours later, the doctors confirmed what I already knew. He had been poisoned. The police were called. Statements were taken. When an officer turned to me, notebook in hand, my mind spun. If I told the truth, I would be accusing Jessica of trying to kill me. If I stayed silent, she would walk free. Jessica sat across the room, eyes red, hands shaking as she clung to a tissue. And then, for the first time that night, she looked directly at me. And she smiled. A slow, knowing, chilling smile. She wasn't scared. She wasn't shocked. She was waiting. The police wasted no time. After everything that had happened, Harry and his parents checked the security footage from the party. The truth was undeniable. Jessica had handed me the plate. She had stood there, watching, waiting. And she had smiled. That was all they needed. Within hours, Jessica was arrested. At the station, she sobbed, voice shaking as she tried to justify her actions. I just wanted Emily to feel sick for a little while. I wasn't trying to kill anyone. But when the officers kept pressing, the real reason slipped out. Jessica was pregnant. She had planned to announce it that night to reclaim her place at the center of the family. But then I had made my announcement first. In her mind, I had stolen something from her. Just like I had stolen Harry. Just like I had stolen the life she believed she was supposed to have. And so, she wanted to take something back. The trial was quick. Daniel filed for divorce immediately, and prosecutors wasted no time building their case. Jessica was charged with multiple counts, including attempted poisoning and reckless endangerment. When the guilty verdict was read, she turned to Susan and Robert, eyes pleading. Mom, Dad, please, you can't let them do this to me. Susan's face was stone. You did this to yourself. Robert didn't say a word. He just shook his head, looking at her like he no longer recognized the daughter he had raised. Jessica screamed as they took her away. Months passed. I gave birth to a healthy baby girl, and for the first time in years there was no shadow looming over our happiness. Ethan grew up never knowing what really happened, never remembering the woman who once tried to destroy our family. But me? I could never forget. I stopped eating anything I hadn't prepared myself. I double-checked every ingredient, every meal, even in my own home. Jessica was locked away, but the fear never left. And sometimes, late at night, I would stare at my reflection and wonder, how could she do this to me? But I already knew the answer. To Jessica, I had never been family. I had always been the enemy. And in her mind, enemies had to be eliminated.